What's up, everybody? Jesse from Plant the Spear here. Thank you so much for tuning in. Glad to be back in the studio with you guys for our Florida State versus Boston College preview and prediction show as the Noles head north to take on the Eagles to try and open conference play with a win. And this is a game where you feel really good about Florida State being able to handle their business and get off to 1-0 in ACC play. But before we get into things, obviously there's one huge factor, the elephant in the room that we have to address, and that's Hurricane Lee, and that's the weather situation. There's still a possibility this game doesn't even get played. Now, as of right now, Thursday afternoon, everything is still status quo on for Saturday noon kickoff. There is the potential that the game could get moved back to Friday. Both teams, Florida State's already on the way up there. The equipment's already on the way up there. They could maybe agree to move this game to Friday, but it seems like originally it could have been moved venues. I think that's out now. And with Florida State looking to be in the hunt for the ACC title game, you want to get this game in. You want to get it played. So if the game does happen in the first place, weather is going to be a factor in this one. And it could be just a high winds, heavy rain, kind of slop fest game that you really just kind of want to get through. And Florida State, I think they're going to be fine either way, but that's just something I want to keep in the back of our mind while we do this preview, because I'm kind of doing it factoring in that I think it's going to be a very wet game. Now, looking at these two teams, Florida State, we know, has a lot of momentum this season. Number 3 in the AP poll, blew out LSU in game one. Another dominant victory last week against Southern Miss, 66-13, put up 59 offensive points. Got off to a little bit of a slow start, but had a good night overall. Defense, I think, had a great night as well. Boston College, on the other hand, they come into this season off of a disappointing 3-9 year last year, but a lot of that was plagued by offensive line issues, which is something we know a lot about. So we can relate, we can understand with that. I actually had Boston College being one of my most improved teams this year because they did fix the offensive line issues. They went from 4 combined starts last year to over 100, I believe, in 30 starts this year, something around 137 starts. They got all ACC offensive lineman Christian Mahogany back. So I thought it'd be a lot better, but they have some inconsistency at quarterback, which we're going to talk about. And the defense really just hasn't lived up to the task this year. So they are 1-1 on the season, got their first win last week against an FCS team, a good one at that. But they did lose game one, 27-24 against Northern Illinois, who's just really not any good. We're going to talk about those two games in just a second. But let's start off with some notes I have on this game that I think we need to talk about. So Florida State is currently a 26-point favorite over the Eagles with a total point, I believe, over under a 48. Now that has come down. Florida State originally opened as a 28.5-point favorite with, I believe, a 56.5-point over under. So you can tell the odds makers are factoring in that weather a little bit. This is also the red bandana game for BC. Now, traveling to Boston College and playing in Alumni Stadium is not typically the place where you think of crowd noise and the crowd factor. But the red bandana game is one where this team normally gets up for it. Their crowd normally shows up. But being it's at noon with bad weather on the horizon, I think you kind of take the crowd factor out of that game as well. Now, Florida State's no stranger to this game. This will be their 4th appearance. They are 2-1 in the red bandana game with their one loss coming in 2017. Boston College overall is 4-5 in this game since its inception, which they did have a top 10 upset the very first year. But, again, this is just because you're ready doesn't mean you're going to be able to win. Now, we already talked about the potential weather impact as well. So that's going to be something to watch there. Florida State, I feel like if the weather gives them a break and they can throw the ball and they can run the ball like they want to, I feel like this game's really going to get out of hand, because when I went back and watched some of the film, it's going to be an obvious mismatch for Florida State's offense against this defense. But this may be one where you have to keep the ball on the ground a lot. And, sometimes in rain games, weird things happen. Turnovers, people slip and fall, field conditions are an issue. So that's really going to be something to really kind of keep an eye on there. Now, looking at some team notes for Boston College, let's first talk about the quarterback situation. So looking back at last year, we know they had Phil Dracovic, who transferred out. Now, Emmett Moorhead played their last 4 games, threw for over 250 yards in 3 of those games, led them to a big win at NC State, or against NC State last year, should I say, the biggest win of the season. Went to ACC Media Days as the quarterback. So all signs pointed to him being the starter. Now, in steps Thomas Castellanos, a rather inexperienced guy who probably has a higher ceiling than Moorhead, but comes in from Central Florida. And I did some research on this because originally I thought maybe Moorhead got injured because they took him out early in the Northern Illinois game in game one, and they let Castellanos come in and run the offense. They said that was their plan all along, which seems a little strange to me for a guy who may be coaching for his job this year, just really after kind of a disappointing tenure so far at Boston College. But I guess maybe they want the dual threat guy, a guy with a higher ceiling, just maybe trial by fire situation. But keeping that in mind, they do use a dual quarterback system. So Castellanos is, like we said, a dual threat guy, leads the team in rushing. His passing wasn't great in the first game, only had, I think, around a 50% completion ratio. It did step up into the 70s in the next game again, FCS team. And Moorhead's only, he's had a limited sample set, but he's only got a 40% completion ratio so far. But they do like to bring him in because he can stretch the field better. Now, is that even going to be a possibility in this game? We don't know. I think if it's going to be a rain game, you're going to see a heavy dose of Castellanos. But they did say that they want to use a 2 quarterback system this year. So we'll wait and see how that goes with how they manage this if the game is extremely rainy. Now, another note I have on Boston College, they have had 10 penalties in each of their first 2 games. We know Florida State had a little bit of issues against LSU with penalties. A lot of that had to do with the bad officiating, if we're being honest. But they cleaned a lot of that up against Southern Miss. So while BC's not been the greatest team, they've also been pretty undisciplined. So you may get an advantage there as well. Now, the last note I have here, which I think is the biggest one to circle, because I think this is going to be a clear advantage FSU in this game, especially if it's raining. Boston College is currently giving up 217 rushing yards per game, which is 122nd in the country. Florida State against Southern Miss ran for over 300 yards in that game, 8.3, I think, yards per carry, and they're averaging over 200 yards on the ground right now. They put up 135 yards rushing on LSU, who has a much better defense than Boston College. And so really this could be the mismatch, especially if you have to run the ball a lot. You have a running quarterback as well. You have a deep running back room, so you can keep fresh legs in this game. We feel good about the depth at offensive line, so you can keep fresh legs in on the offensive line if you have to run the ball all night. So that's just really something to watch there. I think the run game is going to be the mismatch here. But let's start off by looking at the BC offense against the Florida State defense. So scoring offense for BC coming in at 27.5 points per game, 78th in the country. Florida State's defense is only allowing 18.5 points per game, which is 52nd. But do keep in mind, Florida State, with the blowouts, has got deeper into their depth chart than Boston College, who has been really close in both of their games. One was an overtime game and one was 38-31 against an FCS team. So they had to keep the starters in the whole game. A lot of the points per game came against FSU's backup defense. Now, explosive plays, which are over 20 yards, Boston College has generated 7 so far this season, which is 95th in the country. Florida State has allowed 8, which is 62nd. But again, keep in mind, a lot of that was against their backups. Third down offense, Boston College, not great, not bad, 43.3%, 66th in the country. Florida State, on the other hand, has been really good at third down defense this season, only allowing just over 26% of conversions, 15th in the country there. Red zone offense versus red zone defense. Boston College having a good year. 100% of their scoring trips have resulted in points this season. Red zone defense for Florida State has improved this year, 71.4%, 32nd in the country. And again, when you talk about the starters, that number's even better. Sacks allowed, only 1 on the season for Boston College, which is, again, it's a little impressive. But we expected that with the improved offensive line, and now you add in a dual threat quarterback as well. Florida State has generated 6 sacks so far this season, 38th in the country. And talking about that Boston College offense, I think if this is a rain game, it plays a little bit into their hands. Doesn't mean they're going to have the advantage, but they're a team that historically has had an identity of running the ball. They have Garwo in the backfield, who surprisingly only had 2 carries for 14 yards against Holy Cross. I'm not sure if he got injured or anything like that, but he's a past 1,000-yard rusher. They have a decent offensive line, so they're going to look to set the tone and run the ball. And that's something they talked about this week. They are a running team, and so they like games like this. But the problem with Boston College, obviously, like we mentioned, you have to replace Zay Flowers, which is one of the best receivers in the country last year. And they really have struggled to find a guy to do that. They brought in Ryan O'Keefe from Central Florida, who was a productive receiver there. So far, his most receiving yards in the game has been 38 against not the greatest competition. Now, a lot of that has to do with quarterback play. But again, I mean, you have to look at what Zay Flowers did, when I looked it up, I think he only had like one game or maybe two games all of last season under 50 yards. So they've really struggled to find that top receiving target. It remains to be seen if they'll even really be able to throw the ball in this game because of the weather. But if they are, I think Florida State has a good opportunity to bottle them up in this game. They only threw for 168 passing yards against Northern Illinois, and then they did step it up a little bit with 201 yards against Holy Cross. But again, keep in mind it's an FCS team there. So I think really Florida State's defense should have a good day in this one. Boston College is in for a rude awakening because this defense that Florida State's bringing to town is nothing what they saw against Northern Illinois and Holy Cross. So that's going to be a rude awakening for them going against this defensive line. So we will see. But like I said, Castellanos is a guy. He's got wheels. He can make you miss. If he catches the edge, he can do some work in space. But I like that Florida State has already played against a mobile quarterback in Jaden Daniels, and they did a good job limiting his scramble yards. Now, they will do a lot of design runs with Castellanos, and he had a pretty decent game. Jaden Daniels and LSU would design runs, but you've already seen that. So I think you can almost copy and paste the game plan here against Boston College. Now, talking about the FSU offense versus the BC defense, Florida State scoring offense is off to a hot start this year. 55.5 points per game, fourth in the country. Boston College's defense is also allowing 27.5 points per game, 93rd in the country. And the explosive plays is somewhere that Florida State really excelled last year. Third in the country. They're already top 15 again this year with 15 explosive plays of over 20 yards. And again, keep in mind the competition here. BC has allowed 10 explosive plays this season, 91st in the country. And I thought maybe, okay, their secondary got exposed or something like that. But when you go back and you look, a lot of those came on the ground. So if this is a run game, that's still an opportunity for a mismatch for FSU. Third down offense, Florida State has been 50%, middle of the road, 35th there. But the defense for Boston College has been really bad on third down, 126 in the country, 53.9% of conversions allowed. So I'm looking for Florida State to really have a good number here in this game on third down. And if they don't, we know Mike Norvell is the least scared person to go for it on fourth down. So we'll see how that matchup plays out. Now, red zone offense, Florida State's good too. I mean, they have a 100% scoring rate so far, which is also tied for first. Now, Boston College, on the other hand, their red zone defense is not quite what the offense has been. They have given up 100% of scoring attempts that in the red zone, tied for 92nd there. Sacks allowed, Florida State has allowed 2 sacks this season, which we know Southern Miss blitzed a lot, and LSU had a really good defensive line. Sacks by Boston College has only been 2 this year, which is 106 in the country. And honestly, that really surprised me because they do have an all ACC caliber defensive end. They got some guys back from injury. But I really think in this one, it's just a matchup of athletes. And while they do have experience at linebacker, their secondary has some weaknesses. And when I went back and watched the Northern Illinois film, there was a lot of opportunities there. They played soft coverage against them, but the NIU receivers, they just really couldn't get a lot done in space like you're going to see from the Florida State receivers. Pending they can throw the ball. You just have a lot more talent at receiver at Florida State. And if they can get those playmakers the ball in space, this secondary didn't really look that good on film. Now, I think another thing to watch too was NIU had a lot of opportunities, and I couldn't find the Holy Cross game on replay, so I just kind of had to go off the NIU film. But in that game, NIU had a lot of one-on-one opportunities with some of their better players that were potentially big plays that the NIU quarterback just missed. So if the wind and the weather is in their favor and Florida State is able to throw the ball, that's going to be an obvious mismatch. But again, on the ground, Florida State is a team that ran for over 200 yards in 8 games last season. They put up over 300 on Southern Miss, who's probably really comparable to what Boston College has on defense. So I think they'll be able to move the ball through the air or on the ground, depending on what the weather allows them to do. But Florida State should do really well in this game. Like we talked about, you have a deep running back room and a deep offensive line room, so you can keep fresh legs if you're not able to really throw the ball a whole lot. So with that being said, let's first talk a little bit about Boston College's schedule, because I think it is important to add context to some things. When we say they're 1-1, Florida State is 2-0. When you look at these two games, they lost to Northern Illinois in overtime to open the season, 27-24. Now, Northern Illinois was good a few years ago, so maybe you're like, okay, that's not maybe a terrible loss for a team like Boston College. But when you look at week 2 for Northern Illinois, they are not good. They lost to Southern Illinois 14-11. They were a sub 500 FCS team last year. They only put up 11 points. So, really, that was a bad loss for Boston College. And they put up 314 yards in that game, 168 passing, 146 on the ground. They only averaged 4.29 yards per play. That's not great to be under 4.5 yards per play. Florida State is averaging over 7.5 yards per play right now. Only a 39% success rate, 6% explosive play rate, which, do keep in mind, this was the first game with the two quarterbacks, so maybe they had some things to get figured out there. NIU put up 338 yards, 172 through the air, and 166 on the ground. But what I find interesting, they only ran for 63 yards the following week against an FCS team. So they ran right through that defense and did not back it up the next week against an FCS team. So to me, I think that speaks to the struggles that Boston College is having stopping the run. And that makes you excited with backs like Florida State has and this offensive line and the improvement that they have. And your offensive line coach is your offensive coordinator. This is an opportunity, again, where I think Florida State, like we mentioned last week, I wanted to see them get over 200 against Southern Miss. I think that's going to be the case again this year. This week against Boston College. I think they'll should potentially break the 200-yard mark there as well. They did hold NIU to 4.37 yards per play, so not terrible there. Now, looking at the Holy Cross game, I first do want to mention that Holy Cross is a really good FCS program. They were 12-1 last year. Their only loss came against the number one FCS team, South Dakota State, in the playoffs. So this is a really good FCS program, better than the team they faced in week 1 as an FBS opponent. They would probably beat Northern Illinois. But I mean, you're still a Power 5 program, and anytime you're in a dogfight against an FCS team, good or not, that's not a great look. But I think when you look at some of the stats in this game, that's what really kind of speaks about the performance. So they did win 38-31, and there was some weather in that game as well. We saw a lot of games on the East Coast last week go into weather delays, but they ended up winning the game 38-31. And being it was so close, I went in and I was like, well, was this some kind of fluky game? They had a lot of turnovers or something like we're seeing with Clemson or something like that. Boston College had 0 turnovers in this game. So they just failed to pull away from this team. They gave up almost 400 yards on this against Holy Cross. Now, when you look at some of the stats in here, it's kind of wild. So they did up their average yards per play to 5.88, which is a little better than last week. Success rate jumped up from 39% to 54%. They had a 7% explosive play rate. But what really stands out is Holy Cross's numbers. 7.3 yards per play against this defense. 50% success rate, 26% explosive play rate. That's nuts. They had 14 total explosive plays, and 9 of them came on the ground. So to me, that's what really speaks to this game if it does end up being a matchup of two running attacks trying to win in a mud fest. They gave up a lot of big plays on the ground. Holy Cross put up 267 rushing yards in that game on 38 attempts, 6.8 yards per carry. Of their opportunity runs in that game, which are runs of 4+ yards, 50% of their runs went for over 4 yards. They also broke off a run of 35 and 45 yards. So you can see where that explosive play rate comes in. They only threw for 130 yards, but again, if the weather wasn't great and they were running the ball on the ground, then why bother? Boston College did put up 202 rush yards in that game, only 4.5 yards per carry because they did run the ball 45 times in that game. Castellanos, his QBR was pretty bad there, 23.4 in that game. So, again, and like we mentioned, Garbo only had 2 carries for 14 yards there. So I'm really not sure if there's an injury issue there or not. But when you look at that, that's what really stands out in that game is their defense just got ran through by Holy Cross, an FCS team. So again, you're going to be in for a massive jump in competition by them. And realistically for Florida State, what you face in practice is probably better than what you're going to face against Boston College. Now, this is still a Power 5 team. They still have some playmakers over there. And you also have a quarterback who is still finding his way in this offense. So as Castellanos gets more experience, he has got better from game 1 to game 2. So I expect them to be better in week 3 with some more time to work on things and whatnot. But really, this game comes down to a lot of what Mike Norvell talks about. It's not about the opponent. It's about you. You have a talent edge in this game. You have a coaching edge in this game. You're the better team in this game. That's why you're a 26-point favorite. But you have to come into this game and play your best, Or Boston College is a team that can put up a fight, especially if it's a rain game where weird things happen. Like we talk about, you could end up having some turnovers or people slip on the turf or on the field or whatever. So, I think you really just need to come out and not sleepwalk through this game. And we're going to get to the keys of the game because that's a lot of what I'm talking about now. So, first up, the first key to the game I have is set the tone early. Like we said, this is a game that Boston College, I think, is licking their chops because they love to run the ball. That's what they want. Now, they know they're outmatched in this game, but I think if you come out and you set the tone early and let them know that we're here for a business trip, we're ready to handle our business and get back to Tallahassee, then I think that's going to benefit Florida State by getting off to a hot start, which is something we've not seen them do in the first two games where they really kind of came on as a second half team. Which leads me to point number two. I think you need to limit the mistakes in this game. We saw a lot of drop passes the first 2 weeks by Florida State. They cleaned up a lot of the penalties, but I feel like if you can limit the mistakes, Florida State's going to be fine in this game, whether there's 30-mile-an-hour winds and rain, whatever the case may be. If you just play a clean game, Florida State should run away with this one. And my last key is going to be to establish the run, which we already talked about. Boston College is giving up over 200 yards a game, and Florida State is rushing for over 200 yards a game currently. So those are going to be my keys. Again, Florida State should run away with this one. They should be able to come out and win this game, but they just need to play. I just really want to see a clean game from them. And that may be hard in the weather, but Florida State, I think, will handle their business in this one. I did adjust my score prediction down a little bit. I think if the weather, I don't know, say this thing just takes some crazy turn and the weather is beautiful on Saturday, I think Florida State's going to run away with this one easily. But given that it's probably going to be a rain game, I did back my score prediction down a little bit. I have Florida State winning this one 42-13. Like we said, keeping in mind that it may be a heavy run attack with a lot of ground game because of the weather factor. So I still think Florida State's going to be fine either way. I mean, they're definitely the better team in this one. They beat Boston College 44-14 last year. So I really think that the good thing about this game, and if it does get played at noon, and this is not to look ahead because Boston College is still an ACC opponent that you still have to go up there and beat. But I like this game because you get a little bit of a dress rehearsal for next week in that big game against Clemson, a Saturday noon game on the road. And so I like that this is kind of getting you set up. We talked about in the podcast episode, I liked how the schedule set up. You had an early test against LSU, which you passed with flying colors. Then you have Southern Miss, where you got a chance to work on some things. Now you come into an ACC opponent that's kind of been reeling this year, and you should be able to have success there. But at the same time, we haven't really earned the right to overlook anyone yet. And so you want to play well in this game. But, Florida State should be able to handle their business in this one. So we'll see. Hopefully the game even gets played. Hopefully it doesn't get canceled because some of the radar models I've seen just really don't look good for this one. But at the same time, this is a Florida team. They're used to playing in the rain because it rains a lot in Florida. So I'm sure that they have prepped for the weather, probably use some wet balls and stuff like that to be able to control some of the turnovers and things like that. But again, guys, I think this is a game where Florida State's going to be able to run away with. And with that being said, we're going to go ahead and wrap it up here. I got the Noles winning this one, moving to 3-0, 1-0 in ACC play, and getting ready for that huge matchup next week against Clemson. So stay tuned for a lot of coverage because next week we're really going to try and get a lot out because I know Clemson's kind of fell off recently. They're not ranked in the top 25, but that's still going to be a big game. It's not going to be a pushover or anything like that. So until then, guys, stay tuned. Thank you for tuning in and go Noles.